This is the examination of the hidden human condition.
This is the Hidden Killers podcast with Tony Brueski.
We are talking with attorney Eric Faddis today. Want to get your insight, Eric, from an attorney's standpoint on the case against Bryan Kohberger. The defense of Kohberger now getting access to training records of three of the officers involved in the investigation into the murder. What exactly are they looking for from a legal perspective?
You know, I think the defense team here, we've got a capital case, right? The prosecution's pursuing the death penalty, highest stakes you can imagine. And so defense has to really unearth everything they possibly can that could be favorable to their case. You know, in this one, the police department in Moscow, Idaho, nothing against them, but they just likely do not engage in a lot of high-level homicide cases, let alone a quadruple murder. Mm-hmm. And so I think defense really wants to look into what kind of training do these folks have in order to investigate something like that? Have they investigated that in the past? What are the guidelines that the police department has that they should be following for this high-level type of homicide investigation? And then I think they're going to compare that with what actually happened in the investigation, see if they can find discrepancies and use those to Kohberger's advantage.
With something like this, what sort of discrepancies are they going to be looking for, especially when we're talking about looking back at the officers' training, which happened far before this case ever came about? Are they going to be really picking apart personal details? Are they going to be picking apart ways that, the training went good, went bad? I mean, anything and everything they possibly can to see what sticks? Is that kind of what's going on?
You know, I'm thinking everything under the sun, but I think there could be a focus on processing a crime scene. Like I said, it's easy to, in a classroom setting or a lecture setting, get information about what you're supposed to do. But then when the police are in the heat of the moment and don't know exactly what happened, they're trying to learn more. Sometimes mistakes can be made in terms of processing evidence, chain of custody, ensuring the integrity of the investigation, and those kind of things. And so I think that the defense is going to be looking at, was the information and the evidence from the scene processed correctly? Were standards followed in terms of interviewing, in terms of procuring other types of evidence like surveillance video, which we know there is some of in this case. And so I'll be interested to see kind of what comes out from that defense investigation as they're sort of, Monday morning quarterbacking what the police did in the case.
Just theoretically speaking here, when we're looking at this, what sort of discrepancies, what sort of red flags would be sufficient to maybe get a piece of evidence thrown out or have some other direction taken here with this case?
Sure. We know there are some critical pieces of evidence, according to the prosecution, from the scene. There's that knife sheath that has been mentioned repeatedly. We want to see how that was processed, whose hands were on it, whether there was any sort of tainting or any sort of way that evidence could have been compromised. There's a lot of talk about DNA and how that's going to play into this case. And so I think defense wants to make sure that nothing was tainted, that there was no improper procedures that were taken. We also want to look at whether the police ruled out any other possible suspects and how they did that and how thoroughly they did that. And so I think that those could be two focuses from the defense side as they review these training materials and compare them with what actually happened on the ground.
Just playing devil's advocate here. Let's say if they look at the evidence and let's just, for example, pick up the knife sheath. This is just theoretical. Let's say it was handled in some sort of way where one of the officers' DNA would be on it, like touch DNA or something of that nature, the way it was handled. But Kohberger's is still on there. Would something like this, if it was contaminated in some way, shape, or form, purely not intentional, not in any sort of way to frame him or anything of that nature, but just from literal lack of experience, does that then discount the fact that Kohberger's DNA was found on something like that if it was found to be handled improperly in some way, shape, or form?
If Bryan Kohberger's DNA was found on something like the knife sheath, some additional DNA contributor, like a police officer, wouldn't necessarily negate the fact that Bryan's DNA was on that sheath, if it was in fact. I think that's kind of an open question being debated.
Yeah.
But it goes to the thoroughness of the investigation, the diligence, the integrity of the investigation. The prosecution's got a high bar here. They're going to try to put this man to death. And so the jury is going to want to see that everything was done by the book. And the more defense can sort of attack that investigation, the more that is at least something that they can use, some potential foothold to try and avoid a conviction and the potential for a death penalty later on.
Is Kohberger's defense, obviously the goal is to exonerate the client, but at this point in the game, with what we know thus far, are they trying to just save his life? With information like this, if they can find some sort of chain of custody issue, some sort of contamination, could that alone simply get the death penalty taken off the table, yet still be prosecuted for the murder? But because there could be that slight sliver of possibility that something else could have happened, beyond a reasonable doubt, but still, anything is possible. Could that remove the death penalty in things like that? Is that part of what they're looking for too?
Well, it's a little hard to say. We saw in a recent filing by Bryan Kohberger's defense attorneys that they're challenging the validity of any DNA evidence that the prosecution claims ties Bryan Kohberger to the scene. It looks like the prosecution used kind of a creative or novel approach and sort of a genetic DNA tree that they made and then sort of worked back from, at least according to the defense. Yeah. And so I think the defense is still fighting on the merits here. Are some screw-ups in the investigation going to save Bryan Kohberger's life? Probably not. But it looks like defense is still sort of fighting on the merits and seeing what they can try to get kicked in terms of evidence. And if they find a big enough screw up in evidence procurement, would that lead to the suppression of some DNA evidence later on? That'll be up to the judge.
What exactly are they arguing? What can they argue with something like DNA? Arguing the validity of genetic DNA. I mean, these sort of things are sciences. If you were to talk to someone who knows nothing about it, you could probably convince them that, there's a way that it could be inaccurate, this or that, and they could walk away thinking that. But when you actually look at the facts of how these things are developed and how they research and how they trace things back, it's pretty clear cut of how things work. You don't just randomly get someone else's DNA mixed into this where it could be misconstrued for someone else.
Sure. No, I hear you. And I think what the defense is sort of focusing in on is the way that the DNA conclusion was drawn by the prosecution. Here it's my understanding anyway, that it wasn't just your standard, is Bryan Kohberger's DNA on the body of the victim? Yes, case closed, that's it. That's not where we're at. Mm-hmm. Where we're at is the prosecution sort of did this genealogical DNA tree, drew some conclusion that something on the knife sheath found at the scene would have to have been related to Bryan Kohberger's father in terms of a DNA context. And so, there are some avenues that defense needs to look into to potentially undermine that, or at least see if they can. Because, DNA has been a useful tool, no question, in determining truth in our legal system. But it's not a perfect tool. It's not infallible. And so defense is doing the right thing by really investigating whether that DNA conclusion is legitimate or not. And it might be.
You're locked into the Hidden Killers podcast.
Want more? Start binging on all of our true crime podcasts right now through Apple Podcasts and get an ad-free experience when you sign up to be a True Crime Today Premium Plus member exclusively on Apple Podcasts.
More of the Hidden Killers podcast dropping soon.
Press subscribe now.